Excellent. So anyway, let's start back at the beginning with Classics 160D2, Classical Mythology, and today's lecture 5.2 on two of the Olympians, Hephaestus, god of the forge, and Ares, the god of war. First of all, we have to get back to Aphrodite, though, and finish our story of Aphrodite and Adonis. So here's our lineup for today. A few announcements, nothing particularly big, mainly the same stuff. Then we will conclude our story about Aphrodite, discussing the story of her and Adonis. Then we will discuss Hephaestus, god of the forge, go into Ares, the god of war, and then we will conclude with one of the greatest love stories of all time, the story between Eros and Psyche, or Cupid and Psyche, which just has everything you could want in a love story. It has betrayal, it has adventure, it has hot wax being poured on people. It's a story of Eros. It is the original erotic story, so stay tuned. You guys will like this one. All right, announcements. Let's see what we got. Put your screen into speaker view. If you have kind of any questions, make sure to go ahead, shoot those to your TA. If you can't hear me for some reason, I don't know, let me know that, I guess. I don't know what was up with that. I guess the big announcement is get on your radar. A week from Friday, your research proposal drafts are going to be due, okay? So look to have those done a week from Friday. And what that means in terms of the immediate kind of future is make sure you've got a topic for this Friday, okay? And one of the things that's gonna happen in class is that your TAs are gonna kind of walk you through how to go from a topic, right, which we've been working on so far, to actually start fleshing that out into a full research proposal, right? So how do you go from the idea to the full-fledged proposal? So if you're able to come with your actual topic on Friday, you're gonna be in much better shape for that. All right, so let's go ahead and recap a little bit about Aphrodite. So with Aphrodite, right, you guys know the two kind of origin stories so far, right? We get the castration of Ouranos, right? And her rising out of the foam next to the island of Cyprus. That's kind of the celestial or heavenly story. I mean, she's also heavenly in the other one too, but it's a little bit more with the gods related to people. And so what we see with that one is she's the offspring of Zeus and Dione. Then she has offspring herself, so she has Eros in the Erotes, right, kind of facilitating love, but is also the mother of Patho, or this idea of persuasion or compulsion. And as we'll see when we're dealing with Aphrodite, this becomes particularly relevant when dealing with the idea of marriage in the ancient Greek world, right? Marriage isn't something that kind of like young 20-somethings are opting into because they're desperately in love. It's something that families kind of contract into for social and economic and political purposes, that sort of thing. All right, and then with the Adonia, what you see down here, we will talk a little bit about one of the rituals associated with Aphrodite. All right, so remember when we were talking about the relationship between Aphrodite and marriage, that came in large part out of the story of the judgment of Paris, right? And so Paris is this young Trojan prince. He ends up with this golden apple that he has to give to one of the goddesses, to whoever the fairest is. And who he gives it to is, of course, Aphrodite, who has promised him the hottest babe in all the land, who just happens to be Helen, later on Helen of Troy, originally not Helen of Troy. And this causes all sorts of problems because he goes over to Greece, he takes Helen, takes her back across the Aegean to Troy, and that sparks a 10-year-long war, which we call the Trojan War. And what we end up seeing with this is that it's sort of a lesson that can be learned about pursuing marriage, about pursuing a relationship with somebody else when it's based on something like love or lust, right? And what we end up learning is that that can lead to very, very bad things. Marriage should be something that's based on what's good for the family, what's good for the city-state, not necessarily who you're in romantic love with. And that kind of romantic love, right? The gift of Aphrodite, the gift of Eros, when major decisions are based on that, very, very bad things can happen. So, right, the Trojan War, the Iliad, it is very much this epic story about warfare and anger and rage, but it also serves to teach an important lesson about the relationship between love and marriage. Now, we also end up seeing with Aphrodite that she's, in addition to kind of this serious thing, right, about these kind of lessons learned about how not to base marriage on something like physical desire or romantic love, we also end up seeing her as sort of a source of humor, especially amongst the gods. And we can see that, right, she's married to Hephaestus. We'll talk about him in just a little bit. And Hephaestus, like, you know, she's always cheating on him. You just feel really bad for the dude. Hephaestus comes up with a plan to, like, trap her in Ares as they're getting it on with these, like, invisible, unbreakable chains, and he does so. And then all the other gods show up and just, like, kind of make jokes about it. Like, too bad, Hephaestus. I bet you wish you were in there with her. Yeah, so she's kind of a source of humor as well. We talked through some of the sites associated with Aphrodite, right? So when we go to the island of Cyprus on the southwest coast, we can see what's known as Petra Turoniou, the rock of the Greek, from which kind of the physical remnant where Aphrodite arose from the Mediterranean Sea. And we see the site of Paphos, which is where her sanctuary is, kind of just down the road from this. And one of the cool things is not only do we have the remnants of the sanctuary itself, right? There's not a lot left behind. It's one of the older sanctuaries we have in the Greek world. But we have the cult statue too, which in its earliest phase, right, wasn't like kind of an anthropomorphic sort of statue, right? It didn't look like we normally conceive of Aphrodite in, like, you know, the Venus de Milo or the Aphrodite of Milos sort of way. Instead, it's this black basalt boulder, a rock not native to the area, specifically brought in for this. And we also see a sanctuary of hers at the site of Corinth, in particular Acro-Corinth, right? So the main kind of site where most people are living is down below, and then you climb the mountain. You can see today it's covered with this medieval fortress, super cool to kind of hike up to it. But in antiquity, there was a temple to Aphrodite, and one of the kind of main things there was that there were these high-priced prostitutes or courtesans, both men and women, who worked kind of for the temple. And when we look at what the ancient authors say, right, they are always making this connection between Corinth and Aphrodite, and how if you're a sailor or a trader or something like that coming into Corinth, you have to be very, very careful because these courtesans are of such high quality, but also such high price that you're liable to lose all the money that you had spending it on the pleasures of the flesh at the Temple of Aphrodite. Okay, so let's move on to the story of Adonis. This is where we left off last time. And this is set on the island of Cyprus in the city of Paphos, right? So we just saw where that was, and we saw the sanctuary of Aphrodite there. And it begins with a mortal woman, a woman by the name of Mira. And she's not worshiping Aphrodite kind of properly, right? So first of all, she's very, very, very beautiful, so Aphrodite's a little bit jealous. Second of all, she's not kind of conducting the right rituals for Aphrodite. So Aphrodite, a rather vengeful goddess, makes her fall in love with her own father. And this is where things start to get pretty dark. So for 9 nights, she has sex with her dad in complete darkness. Neither of them know who the other person is at this point, right? They're just some like kind of mysterious tryst, and at night in the dark, they're making love to each other. And then after the 9th night, her dad figures out like what has happened, right? And both people are horrified. And her dad starts chasing her around with a sword, right? He's gonna kill his own daughter because of this blasphemous act, right? And so Mira, the daughter, is running away. And eventually she's turned into a tree, the Mir tree. And so you can see here, right, the kind of depiction of her becoming a tree here. And as a tree, what we end up seeing is that she ends up giving birth, right? The result of this kind of heinous act, right? So as a tree, she gives birth, and somehow the offspring of her and her dad is this super good-looking dude, Adonis, right? So Adonis is known as like one of the best-looking dudes in all of Greek antiquity. This is very exciting. We actually have a picture of Adonis. Look at this. Look at a bronzed Adonis indeed. What a guy. Wow, you know, that might be the oldest picture we have in all of recorded history. But the important thing is that Adonis is very, very, very good looking, and so good looking that like the goddesses start falling in love with him, right? Aphrodite started this whole thing just to kind of get back at Mira, and now the tables have turned and she has fallen in love with Adonis. Now, in order to raise Adonis, he's been given to Persephone. So Persephone, when she was down in the underworld, she's raising Adonis here. And so once both of these goddesses kind of fall in love with him, he ends up having to kind of split time between Olympus, time with Aphrodite, and then also time in the underworld with Persephone. And so, again, this super good-looking dude, the goddesses are falling in love with him. And eventually, bad things happen. So the story of why this happens, it's debated. According to one of the kind of versions of the tale, basically Ares is jealous that Aphrodite is in love with this mortal man. And so he sends a wild boar, right, which you can see over here, right? He sends a wild boar to kill Adonis, and he's gored, right? Spoiler alert for Game of Thrones fans, right? It's very much like good old Robert Baratheon in the early seasons, but he's gored to death by a wild boar. And then Aphrodite has to administer the funerary rites. Now Aphrodite and Persephone are just heartbroken, and as goddesses, they mix Adonis's blood with the nectar of the gods, right? Like the food of the gods. And together, his blood and the nectar end up producing the anemone flower. I can never say that right. Anemone, the anemone flower. And it's supposed to be said that if you like look closely, right, the kind of the shape of like the little thing within the flower is supposed to resemble the tears of the goddesses as they were crying over the death of such a beautiful, beautiful man. Now, later in Greek literature, the kind of whole episode is seen both as tragic, right? The death of a young man, especially one who is so good looking and so beloved, but also somewhat humorous, right? And we'll see this again actually with the reading for this week. It's always seen as humorous when especially the goddesses fall in love with mortal men. And as a result, one of the things we see is these kind of feelings end up, and the flowers here as well, end up working together to produce one of the main rituals and main festivals associated with Aphrodite, and that's known as the Adonia, named after Adonis. So, the Adonia festival, this is another one that's only open to women. And we've actually been talking a lot about this. So I don't want you guys to get the idea that like all festivals in Greece are only open to women. No, it goes much beyond that. In many of the civic festivals, the ones that are based around city-states and the patron gods of those cities, really the men are kind of the core of much of that. But the Adonia, like we've seen with some of the rituals of Demeter, only open to women. And the way that this works is what they do is they plant these like kind of small, quick blooming flowers in summer. And they put them on their rooftop, right? They have a little like potted plant, they put it on the rooftop, it blooms, it's beautiful, right? But then very, very quickly in the summer heat, the flower wilts and it dies. And this is supposed to be kind of a metaphor, right? For Aphrodite's love of Adonis, right? It was like beautiful, and it was passionate, and it was intense. and yet it was also very, very short-lived. And in the Adonia, the aftermath of the death of the flower is that the women stage this sort of kind of mock funeral for Adonis, right? So it's both kind of the planting of the flower, watching it die, then staging this mock funeral. And scholars have debated the kind of underlying meaning, kind of what the funeral ends up kind of actually doing. A lot of them have to kind of speculate that this has something to do with the idea of Adonis as this kind of god who ends up dying young, but then coming back in flower form, I guess, but kind of resurrected nonetheless. Okay, now one kind of idea to conclude our discussion of Aphrodite comes back to this idea of patho or persuasion. And one of the things that scholars have kind of recently argued is that this concept, right, we've talked about it in relation to marriage, the idea that women in ancient Greece are kind of encouraged to go along with marriage, even if it's not based on romantic love, even if it's not really exactly the person you're super excited about. But scholars have also suggested that this is a metaphor for one's relationship with the city-state as well. And this is especially the case in Athens, where we have democracy. So the idea of democracy, right? People are voting on things, and you can basically have to go do something that you didn't necessarily vote for, right? If your side loses, the city-state's going in another direction. And so scholars have argued that this idea of patho or persuasion or agreeable compulsion, right? Going along with something that might not feel like exactly what you want to do, also applies to your life in the civic realm, right? That you should kind of go with the city-state, what the kind of group decides, even if it's not necessarily, not necessarily what you chose yourself. All right. So Aphrodite is married, right, to Hephaestus, the god of the forge. We see two different birth stories for Hephaestus as well. We'll talk about those in just a second. And again, when you're trying to identify Hephaestus, just look for the hammer or the tongs, that sort of thing, right? He is the god of the forge, the god of craftsmanship. And so those kind of tools of craftsmanship are kind of the best way to identify him. And we'll see that one of his major sites is a temple to him that's located right in the heart of Athens. Okay, so what is the deal with Hephaestus? Where does he come from? That sort of thing. Story number one, right? Version number one is that Hephaestus is somehow just kind of the offspring of Hera with no help at all, right? Remember, especially with the early gods, they were giving birth to people kind of without any help from anybody else. Think of it as kind of a Virgin Mary sort of thing, except the god of the forge comes out at the end. So Hera is not particularly happy with her child, right? Because he's crippled. And so she ends up so upset at this that she takes poor baby Hephaestus and she just chucks this baby out of Olympus, right? We see later on, right? He's getting cheated on with his wife. Like, Hephaestus is like he's like the most human of all the gods, where you can just empathize with all the terrible, unfair things that happen to him. So version one, he's born to Hera, he's crippled, Hera chucks him out of Olympus. But he's not done, right? So he's gonna get back at Hera by crafting a throne, right? A throne for whoever sits on it is going to be kind of bound to it forever, no longer able to move or get up out of the throne. And so he puts that up on Olympus, right where Hera is going to sit. And Hera sits down, and she's stuck. Now, this is where I think the story gets a little bit weird. So Zeus basically wants to get Hera unstuck, and I'm not really sure why. You think the first thing Zeus would do, right, is go try to make out with a bunch of mortal women and men and gods and goddesses and nymphs and nereids and oceanic nymphs and all that. But for whatever reason, he wants to get his wife Hera unstuck from this kind of throne. and he promises the hand of Aphrodite in marriage, right? Marriage to the most beautiful of the Olympian goddesses, to whoever releases her. And so Hephaestus, as the guy who created the throne, right, knows the secret to unlock it, and he goes ahead and does so, and that's why he gets to marry the goddess Aphrodite. So that's story number one. Story number two, he's actually born to both Hera and Zeus, right? Kind of a more normal version of birth. And when he's born, he's not crippled, right? He's just normal, one of the Olympian gods. But Zeus ends up tossing him out of Olympus. So this time it's Zeus tossing him out because Zeus has chained up Hera. And Hephaestus, right, her son, helps her escape. And so it's almost like the exact opposite of the first version of the story. This time Zeus is the one who's chained her up, probably to go make out with men and women and nymphs and nereids and all sorts of basically anything, animals as an animal. But Hephaestus lets her out, and Zeus, to punish him, tosses poor baby Hephaestus out of Olympus, and he lands on the island of Lemnos. And it's kind of landing there after that fall where he hurts his leg, and that's how he becomes crippled over the time, how he becomes crippled kind of from that point forward. Now, before we leave this slide, let's just recognize that this is like one of the all-time great sculptures from ancient Greco-Roman antiquity here. And so you can see, of course, Zeus saying, "Screw you, Hephaestus, why'd you let my wife go?" And then Hera just like looking onwards, and then poor baby Hephaestus flying out of Olympus with his little hammer there, looking like a hilarious little baby, and the other Olympians, Athena, just kind of watching on. So those are the two stories that kind of go with the birth of Hephaestus. Now, Hephaestus, of course, becomes the god of the forge, becomes the god of metallurgy. He's associated with fire. He's associated with volcanoes. We'll see later on that the goddess Athena is also in large part associated with craftsmanship. And Hephaestus kind of ends up being the kind of like brawn, right? Like the kind of muscle behind craftsmanship, whereas Athena is in large part kind of the brains behind craftsmanship. He has one of his major sanctuaries on that island of Lemnos with volcanic Mount Moskilos. And his two kind of titles, his two epithets from this, we get Polytechnes, meaning Hephaestus of the many crafts, and we get Calceus, right? Hephaestus of bronze. Both of these very much related to the idea of craftsmanship, metallurgy, that sort of thing. Now, when we look at the sanctuaries to him, in addition to the sanctuary on the island of Lemnos, probably the most famous one is actually in the city of Athens. And when you see the picture that we're looking at here, we're looking at the Temple of Hephaestus, also known as the Hephaestion. And this is one of the major temples to the god, and it's sitting right above the Athenian Agora. Now, when you look at this, it's tempting to be like, oh, like that's the Parthenon, right? It's like, this is so well preserved. This is like maybe the best preserved Greek temple in all of the ancient world. And so it's tempting to kind of associate, to think of it as the Parthenon. It's not the really, really well preserved one. This is the Temple of Hephaestus, overlooking the Athenian Agora. Now, we can see it kind of in context here, right? From the Agora itself down below, with the temple to Hephaestus overlooking it. And like, think for a second, right? Like, think why the temple to Hephaestus is overlooking the Athenian Agora. Well, I guess you gotta know what the Agora is. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. This is like the marketplace, right? Later on, it becomes a political center as well. Early on, this is where all trading is done in ancient Athens, right? So you're bringing your goods to the Agora to sell them, to buy other things. And this makes sense when you've got a bunch of craftspeople selling their wares, right? It's a bunch of craftsmen here. And so they have a temple to their patron god, right? Hephaestus, the god of metallurgy, overlooking everything. What was it? Because there was one other. No, I guess that's the main idea. That's the main idea. I really felt like I had one other thing to say about the Temple of Hephaestus. No. Anyway, if I think of it, I'll force you guys to listen to it later. All right, Temple of Hephaestus, Athenian Agora. It's like one of the. Oh, I remembered it. Okay, so all right, when you see temples like this, right, that are super well preserved, and you're like, how the heck does it get preserved that well? We're gonna come back to this later in the course when we look at the Pantheon in Rome, and you're just like, dang, how does that like stand for 2,000 something years? This was built in the 400s BC right here. How does it stand for 2,000 years without like falling down? Now, in some cases, they're kind of reconstructed to an extent, but most of the ones that are still standing with, just through the course of time, these all exist because they get turned into a different religious structure, right? So for ones in the Greek and kind of in modern day Greece or modern day Italy, you get a sweet temple that looks like this because it gets turned into a church. And in like the 700s or something, this gets turned into a church, stay as a church until like the 1800s, and then they kind of strip off the church and you still have this beautiful ancient Greek building. Same thing ends up happening with the Pantheon in Rome, which actually still is a church technically today. If you go over to modern day Turkey, you can also see like ancient Greek and Roman temples. Those end up getting turned into churches first and then mosques later on. So if you see, again, those very well-preserved temples, it's usually because they've been reused for religious purposes. All right. So Hephaestus, right? He seems kind of more human than any of the other gods. Like he just has like a rough life. His wife's like cheating on him. He's getting like thrown down from Olympus. He has to work all day making crap for other people. Yeah, so there's kind of a humorous aspect to it. It kind of represents like the hard work and like unfairness of everyday life. A couple of the takeaways from good old Hephaestus. All right, and then let's look at Ares, the god of war, right? I don't know if anybody has played God of War. Yeah, it's a great game. The new ones, I just finished playing the new one for, I guess it's not that new. It's a couple years old now. The new one isn't really set in Greece, but it's still really, really good. The old ones are really, really good too. And I think if you have like a PS4, you can buy like a collection of all the old ones. And just a lot of fun. Anyway, Ares, the god of war. Once again, he has two different kind of origin stories, either Hera alone or Zeus and Hera. And like Aphrodite, he has a series of offspring as well that are kind of related to who he is and kind of what he ends up representing. You can usually identify Ares, right? Look for the helmet and the shield. He would have been carrying a spear here, right? And what we end up seeing is that with his cult titles, right? Man-slaying Ares or fearsome Ares, Androphantes or Danis, he's associated with kind of the bad side of war, and we'll talk about that. So, it's Ares' sister, Ares, right, who ends up setting off the Trojan War. His kids are Damas, right, terror and fear, and then he also has Harmonia. But Damas, terror, and Phobos, fear, right, those are very much aspects and attributes of who Ares is. And it's Damas and Phobos, right, who accompany him onto the battlefield. And they kind of represent the more emotional side of war, right? So if Ares is out there kind of representing the physical terror, right, that's going on, his kids are representing the mental anguish that accompanies warfare. Now, if you remember Deimos, right, or Deimos, if any of you guys have played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, right, this very much is related to what we end up seeing in terms of the offspring of Ares here, right? Very much the same idea of trying to, not trying to, but epitomizing the idea of terror. Okay, so here is the number one takeaway when it comes to Ares, right? we get several different gods and goddesses associated with warfare in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. And so Athena, as we'll see moving forward, also associated with war. And what they do is they embody different aspects of warfare, okay? So whereas, I kind of mentioned Hephaestus was kind of the bronze behind, the kind of muscle behind craftsmanship, and Athena is the kind of brains behind it. Ares is kind of all the terrible things about warfare, whereas somebody like Athena is kind of the more positive aspects of it, right? Teamwork, courage, bravery, leadership, that sort of thing. That's Athena's deal. Ares' deal is like all the terrible stuff, right? Aggression and rage, destruction. And because Ares is epitomized by these sorts of things, everybody hates him, right? The gods don't like him because he's always causing problems. Mortals don't like him. This is the kind of bad aspect of warfare. And as a result of this, he gets those epithets, right? Danis, or fearsome, or Androphantes, man-slaying Ares. And if you've heard Danos before, right? This is where we get our word dinosaur, right? Fun with etymology. So Danos, right, meaning fearsome or terrible. Saros meaning lizard. Dinosaur, the terrible lizard or the fearsome lizard. Good old, say, basically the Ares of the Jurassic period, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so Ares, because everybody hates him, right? Because he represents these kind of aspects that you're trying to avoid, right? Rage and aggression, that sort of thing. He doesn't have a big religious following. You don't get a lot of temples to Ares. And when we get to Roman mythology, kind of towards the end of the course, one of the things that we're going to see is that this is one of the big places where Greek and Roman mythology depart, right? So Mars in the Roman world, the kind of equivalent of Ares, is somebody that people respect and people worship. And you'll see temples to Mars in a lot of different places because he embodies kind of a wider variety of these aspects, whereas Ares really is restricted to this idea of kind of rage and aggression, terror, fear, that sort of thing. So he kind of embodies, the Greeks feel like are the worst instincts on the battlefield. And one of the kind of interesting things is, he's always hooking up with Aphrodite, and you can see the kind of parallel between, kind of losing your mind on the battlefield and losing your mind in the bedroom, right? In both scenarios, it's kind of, you've lost control of your rational thought. Okay, so let's go ahead and take 2 minutes to do the attendance quiz for today. Today, Heracles is orange, so go in and get orange and select that, and we will pick up at 11:38. right, let's get back to it. I tried to answer a few questions in the chat there. Somebody said I blend in with the slides. I hope I don't just look like a floating head. That'd be very weird. But anyway, I'll get a new shirt for next time. I'll try not to do all blue on blue. Anyway, let's close today with one of the great love stories of all time. The story of Eros, or Cupid, and Psyche, right? So first things first, when we deal with Eros, right, sometimes he's seen, remember when we talked about Hesiod's theogony, he's like one of the original gods, right? One of the primordial deities that's like of the same generation as like Gaia, right? Like the first generation after chaos. But then in other kind of versions of the myth, he's seen as the son of Aphrodite and Ares. And what we end up seeing is that like he kind of does a little bit of everything when it comes to kind of love, right? Both the good aspects in terms of kind of, hanging out with the brides at weddings, inspiring love. He inspires kind of like mating between animals. He causes problems with men, like kind of conflict between men fighting over the same woman, that sort of thing. So Eros does a little bit of everything. Now, one of the kind of distinctions, again, between Greek and Roman mythology is that is the depiction of Eros or Cupid. So later on in kind of Rome, we see like the little like chubby little baby boy, right? Like in his little diaper going around with his like bow and arrow shooting people with his wings. In the ancient Greek world, Eros isn't like this like chubby little baby. He's more of like this like buff, handsome dude, right? And he's like kind of shooting these magical arrows that inspire desire into the hearts of men and even of gods. Now, our story, right, begins on the island of Sicily with a woman named Psyche. And Psyche is so beautiful that like her reputation is like spread around the world that maybe she is even more beautiful than Aphrodite. And what we end up seeing, right, we already saw this a little bit with Adonis, is that Aphrodite doesn't take nicely to challengers, right? So she's not like, she's not even really mistreating Aphrodite, but she's just so beautiful, Aphrodite's very, very jealous. Anyway, the problem ends up being that regular dudes find her such a smoking hottie that they stop worshiping Aphrodite, and that's where Aphrodite needs to step in here. Okay, so Aphrodite, of course, wants to be the hottest babe in all the land. She doesn't want any sort of competition. And so what she ends up doing is she ends up sending Eros, right, with his bow and arrow, with his magical arrows, to go shoot her and make her fall in love with the ugliest person around. So this is, I don't know, not particularly nice by Aphrodite, but this is her strategy, right? Send her son, make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest person around, and that'll teach her to be so good looking. Okay, now, if you've been paying attention to any of the myths this semester, you know this isn't going to work out at all, right? This is not going to go according to plan. And in fact, Eros gets there, and he sees her, and he's like, oh man, she is a smoking hottie. And he like drops like the arrow, and then it stabs him in the foot, and then he sees her, and then he falls in love with her. And now his new thing, right, is going to be to prevent anybody else from kind of falling in love or being able to hook up with Psyche. And Psyche's family starts getting confused. So Psyche has a couple younger sisters, and they're good looking, but they're not like Psyche good looking, right? And it's getting really weird. All of a sudden, like nobody's like pursuing Psyche anymore. Her younger sisters are getting married, even though they're not as attractive. And eventually, the family goes to the Oracle of Delphi, right? The Temple of Apollo, which you can see right here at the site of Delphi. Delphi is like one of the, I don't know, still for my money, it's probably like one of the best archaeological sites in the world. Both because of the remains, which are awesome, and just the physical setting is absolutely stunning. But it would have been in the back of this temple here, where the oracle would have sat and given her kind of prophecies. And the oracle ends up telling her family that what they need to do is they need to go put Psyche on this mountaintop, and there she'll end up meeting her husband. And not only that, but her husband's going to be like a monstrous serpent dude. So nobody's very excited about this. She doesn't want to have to marry like a monstrous serpent dude, but you can't disobey the oracle. So Apollo is kind of like helping Eros out here by facilitating this. So she goes up and is put on a mountaintop, and on that mountaintop, the west wind, Zephyrus, right, the kind of most mild of the winds, whisks her away to this magical palace in the sky. All right? So she ends up at this like magical golden palace. Pretty nice place. It's very, very strangely empty. She kind of has this weird feeling it's been built just for her. And nobody's there. Except at nighttime, this kind of hooded, mysterious character ends up kind of wandering around the palace. And eventually, they end up kind of having a conversation. They start sitting down to dinner. He starts treating her really nicely. But he won't reveal who he is, right? So they have these dinners. They're getting along pretty well. He's not revealing who he is. And Psyche's pretty weirded out. So she asks to consult her sisters. She wants to go see her sisters. And the hooded guy is like, all right, I'll get them for you, right? So the sisters get whisked up to this kind of magical palace. And they see how good Psyche has it there, right? They see the magical palace. It's so luxurious, right? And they like start prodding Psyche. They're like giving her these kind of bad ideas, like, you gotta figure out who this guy is. You gotta kind of pull back the hood and find out. So her sisters leave, and she just can't get this idea out of her head, right? She has to figure out who this is. She had heard from the prophecy earlier, right, that it was going to be this monster. Kind of like a Beauty and the Beast situation. But she just has to let her curiosity get the best of her. And at night, she takes this kind of oil lamp to the hooded man while he's sleeping and bends over and like pulls back the hood, right? And she sees, to her surprise, that it's the smoking hottie Eros, right? And he's super good looking and she's super good looking, and they're gonna make this the best looking babies of all time. And in her excitement, she drops some of the hot like oil from the lamp onto to Eros, who wakes up, and he gets all upset with her. He's furious, right? He was like, the one thing was like, I couldn't tell you who I was. Everything was gonna be great, but I just couldn't tell you. And so he reacts kind of poorly there. And now he like basically runs away, right? And now Psyche starts pulling a Demeter, right? So Psyche now is like realized that this person who was treating her so well also turns out to be like the best looking dude ever. And she's like, I gotta go find him. So she ends up going to Aphrodite for help, right? Aphrodite's Eros' mom. Aphrodite is the goddess of love. If anybody can help, it's her. But remember, Aphrodite's the one who started all this in the first place, and she's still really jealous. And she says, all right, I'll help you, but you gotta accomplish 4 nearly impossible tasks. So the first thing she has to do is she's gotta sort this room full of seeds, right? All these different types of grain all mixed together, and she's gotta sort them into individual piles. And she's able to do this by getting help from these ants, right? She was heartbroken. She sees these ants. They're starting to move a few of them. So she somehow talks to the ants. They do all the work for her. The second impossible task, she's got to get the fleece from the rams, the fire-breathing rams of Helios. Again, seemingly impossible because she'll get burnt up. But then she's reminded by this little river nymph here, oh, just like wait till nighttime, they'll be asleep, easy peasy. All right, then the third task, she's somehow got to get water, a vase of water from the river Styx. But again, she can't just go down to the river Styx. It's like guarded by these serpents. Luckily, Zeus's eagle, Zeus is on her side, gives him the eagle gets the water, easy peasy. And last but not least, the hardest of all the tasks, she's got to get some makeup in this little box from Persephone in the underworld. All right. So she has to go get all the permissions to be able to go down there. And eventually she gets an audience. So first she's got to get past Cerberus, right? She gives him some like little cakes. She finally gets an audience with Hades and Persephone. Hades is like, I don't care, whatever. I don't want anything to do with you. Persephone is like, fine. I'll give you the makeup on one condition, right? I'm going to put it in the box and don't open the box, right? So we all know what's going to happen here, right? So she gets the makeup. She opens, gets out of Hades. Once out of Hades, she immediately opens the box. Out pops Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Psyche falls into an unbreakable sleep. And now it's Eros' turn. Eros has kind of been penned up by his mom at this point. And so Eros breaks out and goes and finds Psyche, and she's asleep, right? And nothing he's doing can bring her back, right? He's a god, and he can't do anything to bring her back. And finally, after trying everything that he can, right, he gives her kind of like one last kiss to say goodbye. And it's the kiss that wakes her up. And then he picks her up and she wakes up and she's alive. And they're still both smoking hotties. And he takes her and they fly up to Olympus to live happily ever after. And everybody's so inspired by this beautiful, loving couple that they give her, right, a mortal woman, eternal life. And we see that love truly does conquer all. So that is your love story to conclude today. For Friday, read the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. This is more of like, this is not quite as romantic in some ways, but it's still a really, really good story. Write the response and then go ahead and bring your finalized topic. Have a great couple days, everybody. We will see you on Friday.